Tēnā tātou katoa. So we'll just begin with the karakia. And Alex, I believe, will share his screen, so I'll just wait for that as well. Thanks, Alex. E te whānau, whaia ki marama, kia whai take I roto I au mahi katoa, kia tū, kia kaha, kia hora te marino, aroha atu, aroha mai, tātou kia tātou katoa. Tēnā tātou katoa e hui hui mai nei, ki ngā manuhiri nau mai haere mai, tēnā koutou katoa e totoko mai ana I tēnei kaupapa. Greetings to everyone assembled here. A warm welcome to all of you guests. Thank you everyone so much for coming along and supporting this kaupapa. E mihi ana ki ngā tūtohu whenua o tēnei wahi, ki te iwi kāinga o tēnei whenua, tēnā koutou. We want to recognize and acknowledge the culturally significant landmarks of all the places that we're in here on Zoom. And we also want to acknowledge all the local people of the lands, tangata whenua, and the specific lands where we all are hailing from on Zoom. For me here in Margaret Bridge, it's Te Akitai Waiohua. And I think for Alex in Wellington, in the River Monastery, Ngatiawa, it's Te Atiawa ki Rangarongotai. Sorry, Te Atiawa ki Whakarongotai. Ko Uni toko ingoa. Hi everyone, my name's Uni. I'm one of the lovely team here. You can see other members here, the Tamaki team and the Wellington team and other team members around from Common Grace Aotearoa. Warmest of welcomes. Thank you so much for giving us your precious lunchtime to be with us. And we hope you'll come away feeling satisfied and full, fed at least in your soul. Thought we would start as well with the whakatoki. Alex, could you put it? Oh, I see there's a comment. Oh, sorry. Thank you for letting me know. Is it better when I talk down here at all? Can you hear me from here? Seems the same. Is anyone else having issues as well when I talk? Nope. It's okay. Okay, thank you for letting us know. If it continues, please let us know if you can't hear me. Yeah, sorry about that. Not sure what's happening there. So just the whakatoki for today. No te roro, naku te roro kaora ai te iwi. With your food basket and with my food basket, the people thrive. I thought it was fitting because the climate crisis is a huge problem, but we do have solutions and they lie in communities and our collective action. So thank you all for bringing your food baskets today. And I'll ask for the agenda slide. So today we are gonna hear about the story of free carbon credits from Alex and an overview of the policy asks, and there will be upcoming actions we can take. So feel free to take notes of all your questions because there will be a time for questions and answers at the end. And Alex Johnston is very, very experienced. So he's former campaign lead for Oxfam Aotearoa, leading campaigns on climate change, refugee rights, overseas aid and more. And he's been involved in a variety of successful campaigns, such as securing an 869 million increase to New Zealand's overseas climate finance, and has run workshops through 350 Aotearoa and church networks and action groups. So very experienced, feel free to ask any questions you want. And if you can't hear us, please message in the chat again. And also there are more facts on the website, which will be, so if you have more questions, there will be facts on the website as well. And that will be helpful for submissions, with referencing back to that. I'll pass it over to Alex now.
Kia ora, Uni, thanks so much. Can you all hear me okay? Those that I can see just nodding, yep. Cool. Thanks so much, Uni, for setting us up for this time, and for the intro to me. Didn't know I'd get that special intro, so thanks for that. Yeah, as Eunice mentioned, I am one of the part of the team at Common Grace Aotearoa leading on this campaign, the Don't Subsidise Pollution campaign. And so I'm gonna, for the next wee while, talk us through the background to this campaign, what it's about, and unpack some of the policy solutions that it's proposing, and the problems that it's trying to address. And so I guess this is aimed at deepening our understanding. You might have some familiarity with the problem that this is trying to address around the issue of free carbon credits and how we can end free carbon credits in New Zealand's emissions trading scheme. So there's going to be some reference to, I guess, terminology or things that can get very jargony and very technical quite quickly. So I'm going to try and keep things as accessible as possible, but I feel free to type in the chat. Can you explain what this, if I refer to a term that you're not quite sure what that is, this is this forum to try and unpack some of those things. So just pop it in the chat or hold on to it as a question for the Q&A time at the end. And so we'll dive into it. So I wanted to start just by framing this up in terms of what brings us together to this issue, what brings us to talk about free carbon credits, why does that matter? And I think many of the people on this call will come to this issue from a perspective of a deep care for our planet and the people that inhabit it and the living things that inhabit it, and wanting to tackle the climate crisis with the urgency that's required. And you know, we've seen that those impacts play out here in Aotearoa over the last year. This is a photo on the left from Cyclone Gabrielle in Auckland. Sorry, for the Auckland floods in January last year. And then there was Cyclone Gabrielle. We've had wildfires recently in Canterbury. We're seeing these increased impacts, and we know that collectively we need to do as much as we can to reduce emissions. And this campaign is seeking to target one area of emissions reductions that is not currently being actioned with the urgency that's required. And I guess putting that in the context of what's the problem here beyond just the fact that we need to reduce emissions? We have a problem that we have some large industrial polluters in New Zealand who make up a really decent chunk of our nation's climate footprint, that are made up by large industrial factories and polluters. One example here is Methanex, the methanol producer based in Taranaki. They use 40% of New Zealand's fossil gas supply. On their own, that one factory creates about 3% of the country's climate pollution. And currently it's subsidized by $50 million a year to keep polluting, to prop up its pollution and avoid facing a full carbon price. As another example, just recently in the news, you may have heard about an announcement regarding the Tiwai Point aluminium smelter. This is another large industrial factory that produces a lot of climate pollution and receives free carbon credits to avoid paying the cost of that carbon. Recently, the smelter announced a new electricity contract, which could see it receive a million more free carbon credits a year than it currently does. The value of those carbon credits added up over the lifetime of the new contract is about $2 billion. And then, so that's another $2 billion in a subsidy to keep polluting and avoid having to decarbonize its process further. So we have some of these large factories with large industrial processes that cause a lot of climate pollution, yet the government policy settings are not incentivizing them to change. They're in fact propping up the status quo. The good news, however, is that, just to put Rio Tinto, the aluminium smelter's climate footprint into context, they produce their emissions are equivalent to the emissions of about 250,000 petrol cars. So that's a big footprint for one factory. In fact, just 4 of the businesses that receive 3/4 of all the free carbon credits, those 4 businesses have a pollution footprint equivalent to 46% of all the cars, petrol cars in Aotearoa. So when we think about that, you know, we are often directed in terms of action on the climate crisis to our individual response, what we can do to take public transport or drive an electric vehicle or those things. This is just 4 companies, 4 businesses producing equivalent climate pollution to almost half of all the cars in Aotearoa. So if we can decarbonize these processes and reduce emissions in these businesses, then we're having a massive impact on our collective footprint. The good news is that change is possible in many of these industries. So one of the big industries that currently receives free carbon credits is New Zealand Steel. They're in fact one of the biggest recipients of free credits, but they last year showcased what's possible to change in this area. So there was an announcement with the previous government last year that New Zealand Steel had agreed to decarbonize one of its furnaces, which previously was burning coal, and they're going to switch to an electric furnace over the next few years. That changing that one furnace in one process in that one factory is equivalent to taking 300,000 petrol cars off the road. It's going to reduce 800,000 tons of emissions every year when it's up and running. And so we can see that change is possible in these industries. The technology is there for many of them. And the question then is, why isn't that happening? Why don't we see more of this type of action from these big industries? And that's because of the system of free carbon credits that we have. So I want to unpack the background as to why these exist. These free carbon credits exist. Why do we have this system? And what's holding it back from transitioning away from it? So we currently have a system in we have an emissions pricing system across New Zealand called the Emissions Trading Scheme. It tries to put a price on pollution across a big chunk of the economy. And it does that to try and provide the most cost-effective ways of reducing emissions across the economy. So when we fill up at the petrol pump or in our household bill, we're facing some of that price on pollution that's passed down to us from the petrol retailers or the electricity retailers. When it was set up back in between 2005 and 2008, New Zealand was, I guess, an early adopter of an emissions trading scheme. And one of the fears of emissions pricing at that time was that if you have big industries that you price their pollution and they don't necessarily have easily available or cost-effective technology available to transition their process and decarbonize, then you risk putting them out of business. And so the worry was that New Zealand Steel or the aluminium smelter back at the time when the emissions trading scheme was set up might shut down and you'd lose a lot of jobs, or that their emissions would they produce products that we use in an everyday way. So we use steel to build houses, we use aluminium to produce goods and services. We use concrete in our cycleways and footpaths. And so these industries, if they shut down, then we'll just still need these products and we'll just import them from overseas from a place that doesn't have as much environmental regulation, and therefore the emissions will just will actually increase globally because they're produced in a more polluting way. So went the argument. So what was set up is the system of free carbon credits, which is called industrial allocation to certain industries that there was an identified risk at the time. And these industries are called emissions intensive and trade exposed. So they're deemed to have a high level of emissions, but be exposed to that trade competition from potentially more polluting options offshore. When this was set up back in almost 20 years ago now, it was intended to be a transitional measure. It was always intended to be temporary. So the initial legislation of the emissions trading scheme, when drafted, had a phase-out date of free carbon credits of 2030. So there was the idea that we have 15 or so years for these businesses to gradually increase the carbon price that they're facing and adapt to this new situation where we're just pricing carbon across the economy. But then the national government under John Key initially indefinitely delayed that phase out and then removed it altogether, so that basically these industries were receiving 90% of their emissions 90% of their emissions were covered by free credits indefinitely. What then happened is that the last Labour government came in and recognised that wasn't sustainable, that needed to change. So they did introduce a slow phase out of these free credits. So in 2020, legislation was passed that introduces a slow phase out. That phase out, however, is far too slow for what we know is needed to ensure a safe climate future. And it's actually too slow to meet our domestic Zero Carbon Act legislation of reaching zero carbon by 2050. So this table shows the phase out rate that was legislated in 2020. So what you can see is that these industries, there's two levels of industry that receive free credits, that orange and blue line. The orange line is those that at the time received 90% of their emissions were covered by free carbon credits. And the blue line is what are called moderately emissions intensive industries that receive 60% of their emissions covered by free carbon credits. And so gradually this phase out goes down by 1% a year, and then the 2030s goes down by 2% a year, 2040s down by 3% a year. What you'll notice is that in 2050, the orange line is not at zero. So in 2050, when as a country we've committed to get to zero carbon, there will still be these emissions intensive industries receiving 30% of their pollution to be subsidized, i.e. they don't face a cost of carbon for 30% of their emissions. And as a country, we are subsidizing that pollution to prop up the status quo. So what that shows is that this current phase out that was legislated by the last Labour government is not actually, it's far too slow. So I've put a face to some of these industries who are in that category already, but just to highlight the kind of 5 or 6 main industries that receive the vast bulk of free credits. We have steel. I've already mentioned New Zealand Steel received 2.15 million credits in 2022. We have the concrete industry, Fletcher Concrete, the production of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer by Balance Agri-Nutrients. There's about 12 companies that produce wood products, so paper mills, toilet paper, wood panels, packaging. Through that production process, they use a lot of electricity, and so they get free carbon credits to offset that emissions price that otherwise face for their electricity use. Methanol that produces Methanex that produces methanol, and the aluminium smelter, as I've already mentioned. So that covers about 95% of all the free carbon credits that are handed out. There's also some small producers of, for example, glass, or some vegetables that are heated in greenhouses that powered by gas or coal, like capsicums and cucumbers, or cut flowers. But they make up a tiny share of the free carbon credits. So their emissions footprint comparatively to these big industries is much smaller. So essentially what we have is that we have a challenge of how we can decarbonize about 5 or 6 key industries. How do we decarbonize them? How do we end the system of free carbon credits for them? Yes, thanks for the question. The credits, that's per year. So they, as well, that was 2022. The entitlement is gradually reducing by 1% a year. But it's dependent on how big that company's emissions are per year. So some of them fluctuate from year to year, and they receive their free credits based on their emissions that they report in that year. So it's going down gradually over time, but at a very slow rate. So just to summarize why it matters, this is an expensive status quo. At the moment, the cost of that subsidy it depends on what the carbon price is at the time, but basically the government is foregoing about $500 to $600 million a year at the moment in lost revenue. What would happen if these carbon credits weren't given out for free is that they would be sold to these companies. So the companies would have to pay a price for their pollution, and that helps to incentivize them to reduce their emissions. The money that's lost from not selling them and giving them away for free is about $500 to $600 million a year, depending on where the price of carbon is at. That cost is going to go up over time as the price of carbon is due to increase. So the foregone revenue is going to become a bigger problem over time. It's incompatible with our climate goals, as I've mentioned. This phase out is not in line with our zero carbon act. What it also means is that as we try and reach our goals and reach our targets as a nation, we're having a big chunk of the economy, about 10% of our country's emissions are made up by these industries. They're not pulling their weight, and so the rest of us have to pull more of our weight in order to meet our targets. So it creates an inequity, and it makes it harder to achieve our climate goals as well. And it's not good long-term planning. So as we see other countries make moves to shift away their heavy industries and find other ways to decarbonize them, we risk that our industries will get stuck in the status quo and will then face much more sudden shocks in the future when suddenly, we have to catch up really fast, or the market for a highly polluting form of concrete manufacturing is no longer there because other countries have decarbonized their production. What we see in that Australia is phasing out their industrial equivalent system much faster. The EU is doing so. In America, they're doing a lot more direct investment and subsidizing of the decarbonization process for these industries rather than subsidizing the pollution. So other jurisdictions are acting, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. So just want to pause there, and in terms of like describing that problem and thinking about how you might describe this problem, if you were to summarize it to someone in a conversation, just want to invite you to take a minute or two just thinking by yourself with the information that I just shared with you. What would be the standout fact that you would try and share with someone to convince them that this is important? How might you go about introducing them to this problem? So just give it a minute or two thinking about that question. Perhaps if you want to pop in the chat what the standout thing to you was, or the way that you might go about describing this to someone else, feel free to just pop that in the chat so we can see what people are reflecting on. Yeah, so some good summaries of what from Marcus of what that money could be spent on otherwise. Alan's identifying the fact that these companies are large multinational companies. I think that's a good point to raise. Yeah, thanks, Jenny. Yeah, it's a historic decision that has to change because it's not fair. So I think, approaching it from a fairness perspective is really good. And if we introduce that sense that we are collectively, we need to pull our weight, and that there's a problem that some industries are not pulling their weight at because of this policy that is holding back their transformation, and that conveying that sense of we all want to do our bit. We do our bit at home, but we need these industries to do their bit, and so that needs to change. And Bobby's sharing from the perspective of depending on who you're talking to, that it would affect our long-term trading and our tax will go up. Well, yeah, thanks everyone for your reflections. And I guess it's a complicated area to communicate. I just want to acknowledge that. And it does take, a bit of explaining to go through. What we try, the kind of key message that we have been trying to convey in this campaign to articulate the problem is that subsidizing pollution during a climate crisis doesn't make sense. We need to be making it as easy as possible for these companies to transform their production process rather than subsidizing the problem. That's one way that we've tried to summarize this in a sentence or two. I'll keep going now in terms of talking about the solutions and what we're trying to call for. So there's three main planks to this campaign in terms of the solutions that we're calling on political parties to adopt and support. The first is, to summarize them, as ending free carbon credits, cutting pollution, and unlocking green jobs in New Zealand's industrial sector. And these three things go together as a package. We're not, we think it's important that we talk about the opportunity of green industrial jobs and a just transition, rather than just talking about how we need to kind of rip the band-aid off for these industries that are being subsidized without the just transition planning. Because they do employ a lot of people, particularly in rural regions such as Southland or Taranaki. So to dive into each one of those in a bit more detail, we are calling for the rapid phase out of free carbon credits by 2030. So we picked 2030 because that was the original date at which these free carbon credits were proposed to be gone by. So we're just trying to put it back to what it was originally intended. That still allows for a transition time, that from between now and then, there's an opportunity to manage that transition for these industries, and that management of that transition is really important. What that means is that we can bring forward the phase out, and that creates an opportunity for what to do with those carbon credits that would otherwise be handed out for free. And so there's two things that we propose to do with them. In terms of to get to zero credits by 2030, what that means is that where currently the phase out is 1% a year, we're proposing that jumps to 14% a year between 2025 and 2030. And then that presents two things that we can do with those credits. The way that the emissions trading scheme works is they can either be, they would be sold back to the polluters to make them pay the price, or we could cancel them, kind of get rid of the credits off the books, and that sort of accelerates the shrinking of how much pollution is allowed by those industries, and so or across the economy. So there's two ways of going about it: sell them back to the companies, which means we're generating revenue for the government to do something with, or cancel them and we can accelerate our targets a bit. And we're proposing a bit of a split around those two options. There's different ways that you could cut the pie, but this graph shows the purple line at the top is what the current phase out rate is. The green line is what we're proposing, and the blue and the pink shaded bits in between is all of the credits that are going to be under the status quo would be freely allocated. We're proposing a split in what you do. So some of them are cancelled, some of them are sold back to polluters. And what that gives you is a whole lot of the cancelled credits allows you to accelerate our targets and make it easier to meet them. And the auctioned or credits that are sold back to the polluters generates revenue that can be reinvested in climate action. And so we've calculated, based on the Climate Commission's pathways, how much revenue that could generate. By 2030, it's around $1.4 billion, and by 2035, it's $3.5 billion. So that's a lot of money that can be reinvested back into supporting these industries to decarbonize, or invested in other parts of climate action in New Zealand. So then this is the second pillar, is how we use that money and what do we do to support these industries to decarbonize. So we're proposing that we put funds from ending free credits into the upfront costs for decarbonising some of these industries to help them do it. We don't think, however, that that would just be kind of free money, that should be in the form of a loan or a loan or something that attaches strong conditions to that. But we recognize that it's quite expensive to transition some of these industrial processes, and that there's a kind of nationwide benefit to us doing that. And so some industries, it might be commercially viable for them to switch and make the investment overnight. For some, that might be the difference between them staying in New Zealand or shutting down shop and going overseas. And if we recognize that we do need aluminium and we need steel to build greenhouses, we need concrete to build cycleways and bridges and things to decarbonize our transport system. We need steel to build railways. We do need some of these products. They're not all inherently bad businesses, but we just need to decarbonize their processes. And so to stop them shutting up shop and going overseas, there's that help from co-investing in the decarbonisation process. The third pillar is what we do to how we can also protect the jobs that are involved in them. And just noting Alan's comment, we don't need methanol, and I agree that some of these industries are inherently fossil fuel based industries that don't have a place in a long-term climate future. Some of them are products that we do need to use to decarbonize the wider economy. So the third pillar is around how we can unlock green jobs in these industries and ensure a just transition for any affected workers. So the three aspects of this, I'll just summarize them and then go into more detail, is we're proposing that New Zealand introduce a carbon border adjustment mechanism on imports for industries that would be vulnerable to that offshore competition. And that is essentially proposed to be something that swaps out the free credit system for this carbon border mechanism. I'll explain what that is shortly. The second way that we can protect jobs is that the government invests in sustainable infrastructure like railways, like cycleways, like warm public housing. And the demand from doing that, from the demand for steel and aluminium and wood products and concrete, from doing that, helps to maintain some of these industries and jobs, even as they face the increased cost of carbon. And then where there is a situation of an industry like Methanex, which might need to shut down, that the government funds a just transition plan and involves workers in that just transition planning where there isn't a decarbonisation option available, or where the industry decides it's going to leave the country. And so that's, again, a key way that we can try and manage the transition at this time. So I'll go a bit more into this concept, which I imagine is new for many people, of a carbon border adjustment mechanism. So this is a carbon border mechanism. Imagine it as like an environmental tariff at the border, which is aimed at preventing the leakage of those emissions offshore. So New Zealand Steel just shuts down, and then we start importing Chinese produced steel, which uses more coal than the partially decarbonized New Zealand steel production. That's a situation we want to avoid. Currently, the free carbon credits is in theory trying to avoid that situation. But there's a better way of doing it, which makes New Zealand Steel face the full carbon price, where we create a level playing field between New Zealand Steel and Chinese-made steel, for example. And that's through an environmental tariff at the border. So if a construction firm wants to import steel from a country that might produce it in a more polluting way, the cost of that steel to import is equivalent to the cost of producing it domestically if it's made in a more polluting way. So you add a tariff to equalize the cost. If, however, steel made in China happens to be less carbon intensive than steel made in New Zealand, then it wouldn't face that cost. And so that's incentivizing the lower emitting product to be imported. So it's creating that level playing field based on how emissions intensive they are. And the difference to the status quo is it allows the domestic industry to face the full carbon price, which they're not currently doing. And this is something that the European Union has adopted. They've legislated for it, and they are phasing a carbon border mechanism in and swapping out their system of free carbon credits, which is very similar to our own. Over 10 years, they're phasing it out and phasing in this carbon border tariff at the EU's border, which is a major jurisdiction to go about introducing this. So there's an example there for New Zealand to follow. And I think that's really good news and a good opportunity to highlight that essentially a major jurisdiction has figured out how to deal with this technical hard problem of decarbonizing these industries with this carbon border mechanism. And we want to do the same. The thing to note is that a carbon border mechanism doesn't help exporters. It equalizes the costs of where that steel would be produced and used in New Zealand. For example, for the TY Point aluminium smelter, 90% of their aluminium goes offshore. And so they wouldn't be benefited from that border mechanism. Therefore, we need other things that if we want aluminium production to stay in New Zealand, we need other ways that it can to support them to decarbonize and face the full carbon price. Essentially, touching more on what some others have said about a carbon border mechanism, it's got some good support from within the construction industry in particular. So Andrew Eagles, the CEO of the New Zealand Green Building Council, has said, there's often concern that the cost of decarbonising may leave New Zealanders flocking to cheaper, high-polluting offshore alternatives. A carbon border mechanism, as the EU is taking ahead, will help level the playing field and ensure New Zealand industry can remain competitive while tackling their emissions. Wholesome Cement, which is one of the major cement producers in New Zealand, they support the phase out of free carbon credits and phase in of a carbon border mechanism based upon the model agreed by the EU. And they won't publicly say this, but Golden Bay Cement, their main competitor, has also previously in government submissions indicated their strong support for a carbon border mechanism as an alternative to free carbon credits. So some within industry recognize that this is a good alternative if it works for their industry. In terms of the impact on trade agreements, that's a really good question. So the EU was one of the big kind of forging ahead and navigating that question of how they make it compliant with their trade agreements. And they've done that, and it now remains to be seen whether they get challenged by the US or other countries under the World Trade Organization rules as to whether that is fair. However, there is a section of the World Trade Organization rules that allows for countries to put tariffs on products where it's for a environmental or wider societal benefit. So, for example, for health, tobacco products is what's often referenced, and there's a similar kind of carve out for environmental tariffs. So, between these different ways that we look to try and transition the industry, there's kind of 4 key questions that this table is trying to highlight. Is there technology available for some or all of their process to be decarbonized and avoid the increased cost that might come from removing free credits? Does a carbon border mechanism help them? Would they be helped by domestic investment in railways and public housing to help the supply side of things? Sorry, the demand side of things, that's the 4th column. Would they be helped by co-investment in decarbonizing their process from the government? And then would facing the full price of carbon lead to a likelihood of closure is the last column. And so these are the main industries here. And what you can see is for most of them, there's some combination of good options here between them. So there's basically technology options for most of these industries. Some of them would be helped by a carbon border mechanism. Some of them would be helped by co-investment to help them decarbonize. some of them would be helped by that demand side incentives like green infrastructure investment. The only likelihood of closure would probably be Methanex, which we would say is not necessarily a bad thing because their business model is based on a fossil fuel based business model. So we do know that over the long term, there isn't a place for fossil fuel based products in a zero carbon economy. There is potential there that on the first column for Methanex, there is potential for them to transform to fully hydrogen based methanol, but that's highly contested, and yeah, I won't go into more detail there on that. So that's kind of an overview of the solutions that are proposed by this campaign. In terms of next steps for this campaign, what we are trying to do is to raise as much profile about this issue as possible to the Minister of Climate Change and trying to get the government to start the process of ending free carbon credits and bringing in the alternatives over the next 5 years. That's the key window to do it, so we can get to zero credits by 2030. The key opportunity here is to try and get something in the upcoming emissions reduction plan that starts that work. And so we are handing in our petition next Tuesday at Parliament. And so if you're based in Wellington, we'd really love for you to come along at 12:30 on Tuesday the 18th at Parliament to help us hand in the petition. We'll also love your help in getting as many signatures before that hand-in date as possible. We're so close to about 6,000 signatures, so it'd be great if we can get to 6,000 before we hand it in. If you want to know more details about the petition handover, check out our Facebook page, Common Grace Aotearoa, and there's some details there. The other thing that you can do is to write to the Minister of Climate Change, conveying why you care about this issue and why you want him to put in place a plan to end free carbon credits. And we've created a resource that's online that helps you do that, provides a bit of a template and some pointers for what you could say. And there's a link there on the slide that if you type in bit.ly/endfreecredits, it takes you to that template and shows you how to write that letter. That's something you can do personally or with a group. But we also want to flag that coming very soon, potentially next week or the week after, will be the government announcing their draft emissions reduction plan and inviting public consultation on that. And that's the opportunity where we want to mobilize as many submissions as possible on that plan that call for an end to free carbon credits and outline the solutions that we're proposing. And so we'll be trying to build it to provide submission guides and tools that make that as easy as possible for you to make a submission yourself or to mobilize a group, whether that's a group that you're part of or a church or just your friends or flatmates, to make submissions together. And so there'll be more details to come from us. If you've signed the petition or if you're on Common Grace Aotearoa's mailing list, we will provide you with details around that when we know when the plan is being consulted on. So those are some next steps around how you can get involved. I'll stop talking there and we will go over to some time for Q&A. Just looking at the chat and seeing if there are questions I've missed in the chat. So a question from Diane about, would Methanex closing relieve gas transition anxiety and close down the exploration debate? It's a really good question, Diane. The short answer is yes, in that there's, you may have seen in the news about the worry about when it's a cold winter morning and we don't have enough gas, and that's being used to meet the peak power demand, and that's being used as a justification to justify more oil and gas exploration. Well, 40% of New Zealand's gas supply is subsidised currently and it's used by Methanex. If Methanex wasn't in the picture, or if they lost their subsidy, suddenly we have plenty of gas to meet that peak demand, and we don't need to explore and drill for any more in New Zealand. And that's a really powerful argument against the need for more oil and gas exploration. And it's often in the assumptions that are put out there by the government or commentators, they miss the fact that the main user of gas in New Zealand is currently subsidised to maintain their status quo. And so the business model is built on that subsidy. Question from Mike around how you can sign the petition. Yeah, we'll chuck the website URL. Oh, great. Thanks, Oliver, who's done that. Really appreciate you sharing that. So there's a link there to how you can sign the petition. Question from Leah. How does the government get its carbon credits to start with? What stops companies from buying their credits cheaper offshore? So yeah, a few questions there. So the carbon credits are part of the wider market in the emissions trading scheme. That's a domestic market. So currently they can't be purchased from offshore, but they could be purchased from forestry producers in New Zealand who by sucking up carbon, they get given allocated credits. It's like a kind of form of its own currency that they can sell to the polluters to offset the pollution. So they can either purchase them, a polluter could purchase credits from the government or from the forestry producer. The government creates that market, it creates that alternative currency of carbon credits, and it tries to manage the market through how many it decides to sell back to polluters. So they set a cap on how many credits are out there, and they're trying to reduce that cap over time by selling less back to polluters. However, there's been a flood of credits in the market because we've planted a lot of forestry, and also there's a big stockpile that built up that polluters are holding on to, that when the market was very broken. So there's a big problem of other problems to do with the carbon market, but the fact remains that the free carbon credits that are handed out to these polluters could be sold to them rather than handed out for free, or they could be used to help shrink the size of the carbon credit market overall by just cancelling them. So the revenue, yeah, the government currently receives revenue when they sell their other credits, and that previously was used, that revenue was used to fund all our other climate policies like subsidizing purchase of hybrid vehicles or other things. Under the recent government budget, and so that was about a couple of $2 billion a year in revenue, and that was used to fund climate policies. Now the current government has used that to fund their tax cuts. So it does go, it used to be segmented off just for climate action. Now it's gone back into the main pool of government money to spend on other things. Linda, the recording, yeah, so we'll share this recording by email to all those that have signed the petition. Yeah, and we'll share it on Common Grace Aotearoa's Facebook page as well. And possibly, yeah, we could put it up on YouTube as well. So the link will be sent out to those that have signed the petition. Yeah. I'll stop sharing my screen, and perhaps if others have questions and you want to pop your virtual hand up or real hand,
Shall I stop recording now?
I think keep recording just while we have questions, and then because those others might be thinking the same sort of question that might be helpful for others. Yeah, feel free any questions that even if it's not something you think might be helpful for others to unpack further, because I realize there's a lot of information there in a short period of time. Go for it, Leah.
Hi, I'm sort of trying to think my question through as going. So
I might get to the end of my question and realize I answered it myself. But so you were saying that the credits that the government has sort of created by say environmental initiatives, the planting of trees, etc., and that creates credits, and then the the government's giving most of them for free to these big companies. Looking at just that picture on its own, you'd then I assume that therefore just looking at that piece of the puzzle, it's largely coming out carbon neutral because you're getting the credits and then passing them on. So somewhere else in our country, there's we're using up a lot of we're emitting a lot of carbon. Is that mainly in cars, or is where is the other bad part happening?
Yeah, so just to clarify, so the carbon credits that are generated by forestry are those don't go to the government as such. So they can be sold on the private market. There's a private carbon market, and then there's the government auction. And so the polluters can choose to go on it's called the secondary market, or the government market. And so it's the credits that the government sells are sort of created through government policy, essentially. So they are the government says we're going to allow a set amount of pollution a year, and we're going to reduce the amount of pollution that we allow each year to try and meet our targets. And they say, okay, this year we're going to sell 20 million carbon credits because we think that selling 20 million when combined with what we estimate is out there from forestry producers will shrink our overall emissions by 1% this year or 3% this year. And then so of that 20 million that they create, we're going to give 5 million of them away for free, and we're going to sell 15 million of them. So the government, so that's how that works. So the pollution from cars, for example, it's creating a market and then shrinking that market over time, so that over time the emissions are incentivized to reduce. In terms of the pollution from cars, because what often gets one argument that often gets spouted from certain sides of the spectrum, when they say, a policy that would help people to purchase electric cars doesn't actually have any impact on our overall emissions because emissions are capped. And so is that what you were getting at with your question around where the pollution from cars affects that market?
I think it was coming from the misunderstanding that the government just basically creates their credits, and so therefore there is no sort of offset, environmental offset to the credits that they're then handing on to big business. One other quick question. I have seen in those early days the big business receiving credits and then basically using them as a trading mechanism to profit on. It sounds as though that window has been shut down sometime over the years, where they were basically able to sell the credits they were receiving and then buy cheaper credits offshore to still meet their credit requirements, but actually profiting in the middle. But it sounds like that's been shut down.
The offshore part has been shut down, but they still very much can sell those credits that they get from the government for free. They can sell them on. So that's one of the arguments put forward by some of these industries around, they say, oh no, we need these free credits because that's what's going to fund our decarbonization, because we sell these back at a certain price, we can make a profit from that, and that funds our investment in low carbon technology. That's one of the arguments that's currently used to maintain the status quo. that wasn't the purpose of why the credits were set up as a policy. The policy purpose of free credits was not to allow them to sell them. It was to directly correlate to their emissions. So they, that kind of profiting from them is still happening, but not from access to offshore credits, but from access to cheap forestry credits, or from a stockpile that they've stocked up over the years and they're still holding on to.
Okay, thanks, Alex.
Question from Marcus. We've probably got time for one or two more.
And there's a question from Nigel in the chat as well.
Hello. So I was just thinking, yeah, that's all good and well, but if they're actually using that money to pay large dividends to their shareholders, then that argument falls flat.
Yeah.
So has anyone actually looked into whether they are actually using the money gained from that scheme to converting one of their coal boilers over into an electric boiler, like the coal people are doing?
That's right. I mean, the current status quo has no guarantee that those credits will get put towards decarbonisation. Whereas if we make the investment in decarbonisation like something that's tied directly to a specific funded project, like the New Zealand Steel decarbonisation, then we know that that public taxpayer money is actually going to the decarbonisation, rather than just a vague promise from the company that they're going to use their free credits to.
That sounds wise.
To do that.
I'm concerned. Let's say the government fully gets on board with this. They see this petition and they think, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Let's do it. Half the people, who this would negatively impact, companies who this would negatively impact, suddenly they'll scream bloody murder and create a big hoo-ha, and then the government will back down, or will they go through with shutting up shop and moving overseas? Or is there ways of dealing with the harmful fallout that this campaign, if successful, might engender?
Yeah, so that's part of the I guess the aims of why we're packaging this up as a package of policies alongside the just transition planning and other measures to support industry, rather than just focusing only on removing the free carbon credits with nothing else attached to it. There is a risk that if the government picks up that aspect alone without the other parts, that it would have quite negative fallout. So that's why, as a campaign, and the petition is calling for all of those things together. And I think that's important to get get more of the public on board for whom they might be worried about that jobs impact as well. Question from Anne around what is Australia doing? It's a good question. They don't have a exact system. Their system is quite different, but at a very simplistic level, they are trying to set a cap on industry emissions and shrink that cap over time, and that is because they don't have a carbon market in the same way we do. But they're shrinking the rate at which they're shrinking the onus on industry in terms of the reduced subsidy to pollute that they currently have is more than double the rate at which we are currently shrinking, phasing out free credits. So they're not exactly equivalent systems, but they're acting faster than we are in this space. Question from Nigel in the chat, sorry, about the carbon released by Tiwai Point. Yeah, it's a good question. So there is two, the electricity that powers Tiwai Point is green electricity from Manapuri as a hydro power. However, there is carbon dioxide released in the production process of creating aluminium, and that's so that's a direct through the can't remember the technical name of the term,
electrolysis or something.
Process. Electrolysis, that's right. So that produces CO2, and those emissions are around 600,000 tons, the direct emissions. there's also an argument that they use so much electricity that we have to burn more coal in Huntly to power the rest of the grid. And so there's a kind of a indirect emissions that are created across the economy from 13% of the country's generation going just to that one factory. But their direct emissions are around 600,000 tonnes.
There's also a question from Diane from earlier as well.
Oh, thanks, Uni. Process to agree a shutdown. Yeah, that's a really good question. That's one of the possible options would be a factory or one of these industries sort of having an agreement, a direct agreement with the government that they're going to sort of cash in early all the free credits that they would get and use that money to directly invest in either decarbonisation or your questions around a shutdown. Yeah, to be honest, I don't know about the shutdown question. I suspect that there's some contractual aspects there. I mean, what we saw with the Tiwai Point recently, they'd been in an uncertain future until just recently, this last week. In that there are ways for, if the government wants to actively manage that transition, if it's determined to shut down, then there are steps that the government can take to help manage the process rather than just a fast shutdown. So like, keeping Tiwai open on certain terms, and then I imagine something similar could be done with Methanex as well. Just acknowledging the time and that it's after 1:30 now, and if people are happy to stay on, I'm happy to answer more questions, but perhaps Uni, I'll hand it back to you to close our space. I'll share my screen again for the closing slide.
And yeah, I just want to say thank you so much to everyone who's come along. I've really appreciated the engagement and the questions. And thank you to Alex for all that amazing maturanga. And thank you also for all the teams in the Common Grace. So, koa e ngā mahi o tēnei hui, ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. The objective of this meeting has been achieved. We thank you all. And we'll end with the closing karakia. But again, Alex can, as he said, he's happy to stay for the questions. Kua tipu ngā rākau. Kua pua wai ngā hua, kua waiata ngā manu, kua tau te wau, kua tau, kua tau, kua tau e, haere mai te aoatanga, omie, huie, tai kie. Thank you, everyone.
So much for coming along, and we can stop the recording there, Sylvia, but I'll maybe stay on for a few more minutes in case